In my last video, I talked about the ways that Brexit had been used to manipulate and persuade people into believing into Brexit. And in that video, one of the commentators issued me a challenge. So my thanks to Peter, because he's actually issued me a really good challenge. And the challenge is to make a good argument for Brexit. So I'm going to do that in this video. Just as an aside, this is a really good technique to use when you are preparing for a negotiation. I would encourage you to try and argue it from the other side. And I do mean genuinely try and argue it. Try and persuade yourself almost of the merits of the other side's arguments. That, what would they use? How would they approach the issue? What facts and figures might they draw upon? Because if you examine all those sorts of issues, and all the arguments that they might deploy and all the evidence that they might gather, that's a really good way of preparing yourself for that negotiation and preparing yourself to counter what might come the other way. But for this video, we're going to argue the other side of Brexit. So when we talk about Brexit, there's a lot of things that people talk about, reasons why they voted, or even what are supposed benefits of Brexit. And I've listed some of them here. It's not a fully exhaustive list, but this is definitely the most common theme. It might be about immigration. You can argue that people may have valid concerns. You can argue this is a very racist agenda. That is one argument. Economic argument. Supposedly the UK would be able to do better outside of the EU. There were people talking about the UK able to set its own laws, not being bound by EU laws, although if you ever challenged anyone to actually name a law, they struggled quite badly. There was talk of sovereignty, whatever that means. And even talk of, about benefits to farming, benefits to fishing, all those sorts of arguments, some of which were made at 2016, some of which were made later. Well, the honest truth is, I'm not going to talk about any of these arguments in this video, for the simple truth is, it's all crap. None of these arguments hold water, nor are they actually intended to. Every single one of these arguments can easily be disproved as a benefit to Brexit. There are no benefits to Brexit, certainly not in the short term, under these arguments. And they're not meant to be. Now, there's one exception, I might say fishing, and I only say that because all the chaos and turmoil created by Brexit actually reduces fishing around UK waters, which probably is beneficial, mainly for the fish. They do need to stop being overfished and allowed to replenish their stock. So that's the one benefit I might point to. But all of this is political noise, and it is deliberate political noise, because the politicians who promoted Brexit want you talking about these topics and arguing, because what they don't want you to do is talk about the one good argument there is for Brexit. What is that argument, you might say? Well, I've tried to sum it up in one word, and that word is accountability. And it's a difficult word perhaps to use, and I know many people struggle to explain this, those who voted for Brexit. But actually, there is a strong accountability argument. I'm going to try and break this down and dig into this to explain this. Now, there's many reasons why people voted for Brexit, not always very coherently, not always very articulately. But there's just two that I want to focus on here in terms of arguing, the one argument that there was for Brexit. And I can't take all credit for understanding this. So what I'm going to do is just rewind back to 2016. I wish I could remember who it was who did this, so I could give them the credit that they are due. But some academics analysed the Brexit results. And what they noticed was that there was a very interesting correlation between, not exactly, but pretty close. There's a correlation between those who voted quite strongly in favour of Brexit, but who also received significant amounts of EU funding for their areas, their regions. And that seems like a very strange correlation when you think about it, because surely you wouldn't vote against the people giving you money. You'd be like a turkey voting for Christmas, surely, with that sort of argument. But actually what these academics analysed and what they believed is that there was a more sophisticated thing going on here. And what was happening was that the people in those areas did not like being beholden to the EU. They did not like receiving handouts. They wanted to be communities that were more self-sufficient. Quite specifically, they also wanted the ability to vote on that money and where it was allocated. Because think about it, the EU and Brussels is a very distant institution. And as much as some of the good work that they might do in trying to reduce poverty and build up communities and so on, they don't feel close to the people that they give that money to. And if the people on the receiving end actually feel that that money was wasteful, not done correctly, they don't have any ability to vote for someone directly who can change that. So there's definitely very much a democratic deficit now, and the EU has this all across the board actually. And it's not the EU's fault necessarily, because part of the problem here is that if there's poverty in a particular community, or lack of democratic accountability, shall we say, it's the responsibilities of the national governments to fix it. But for various political and other reasons, and this is not just restricted to the UK, various national governments had failed to tackle those issues. So the EU has stepped in. But the EU doesn't get any thanks for that. And in fact, it's not even in the interest of the national governments to give credit to the EU for putting in that money, putting in that investment, because that just reveals their failures. It undermines their political legitimacy. So what has happened for many years, in particular in the UK, is that when voters went to vote at EU elections, they didn't treat it as a vote for something significant, as a means by which they could elect representatives who would go to the EU and represent them, secure them funding, secure them rights, anything like that. They didn't feel that connection. And I can't speak for other European countries, but I believe there's a similar problem there as well. So what it ended up, particularly in the UK, is that when you voted at EU elections, people voted for or against the main political parties in the UK. And that's essentially what it became, or perhaps even a protest vote. So this created this democratic deficit type scenario, and where the EU just didn't have that legitimacy. And people wanted to vote for people that they could hold accountable for what happened in their areas. That is one argument. There's also a second argument, and that is the issue of globalisation. Now, globalisation agenda it's been going on for quite a long time now, and it's very much an international movement to reduce poverty worldwide. And it's delivered some success stories. It's been quite successful in that regard. It's been quite popular, and people have seen it as a good thing to do. The EU is a very big proponent of the globalisation agenda. But there is a problem with the globalisation agenda, which is that with anything, you end up with a bit of a scenario of winners and losers. So ironically enough, the globalisation agenda has done very well, well not say very well, but has some successes in reducing poverty in the developing world. But conversely, what it's also done is removed attention and perhaps some will and perhaps investment in addressing certain areas of poverty in the developed world, like in the UK. The UK has quite a number of pockets of poverty, and those people living in those communities feel very neglected. They feel not listened to in terms of their democratic vote, and also people that have no power have no ability to influence agenda, and who are neglected in favour of international issues as opposed to caring about national issues. Now, ironically enough, this was targeted toward the EU and the whole Brexit agenda. So this is, for example, the spending the £350 million per week in the NHS. That was very much targeted at people in this sort of category who felt left behind and wanted the attention and the money to focus back on national affairs to address national issues. So these are the two sort of big core themes that Brexit politicians will never talk about. They will never talk about people who voted for Brexit for these reasons. And that's because it doesn't make them very comfortable at all. Because what has Brexit actually done? I mean, you can make the obvious answer. It wrecks the UK economy. And surely, if you wanted to fix UK democracy, accountability and so on, surely there must have been a better way to do that than wrecking the UK economy. But let's park that a little bit for now. I'll come back to that in the theme. But what Brexit has done is it has distanced the UK from globalisation. We're no longer in the single market. We're no longer part of that theme. And even all those free trade agreements, well, they're so rubbish, really, that they're not exactly going to improve trade. So conversely, what that could mean is that British people with money in their pockets will have to shop local. Or British businesses looking for markets, looking for opportunities, will have to look local. So the whole agenda here is that Brexit will benefit the UK, possibly to the detriment of the globalisation agenda. Some people call this the Little Englander type syndrome. And there's a grain of truth in that. There is this strong desire to try and improve the lot of the UK, not at the expense of, for the benefit of the others. Think of all those international, all these oligarchs and so on, buying expensive houses in London. Make the UK a less appealing place for them, they may stop driving up house prices. There's an argument to be made for that. Perhaps more fundamentally, what Brexit has really done is that it's exposed a whole host of weaknesses in the UK democracy. Because here's one of the slight ironies of voting in favour of Brexit for more democracy, more accountability, is that the EU, on a sort of structural, constitutional level, is actually more democratic than the UK democratic system. And that is because the UK democracy, embodied in Westminster, is a very old democracy. It hasn't really been updated, and it's very much showing its age. It's a democracy that was designed for wealthy, aristocratic gentlemen to indulge in playing politics as a hobby. You can look at the MP salary and expenses scandal as a classic example of it. That was a system that didn't need to pay people lots of money because they had lots of their own wealth. If just they had to cover some of the cost of travelling to London. That is a very outdated concept that doesn't really stand the test of time. So really what has happened is that a lot of the blame for the democratic deficit issues have been focused on Brexit and the EU, but actually it's all in Westminster. All the issues that people care about, all the things they get angry about, are all things that Westminster has done or failed to do. For example, alleviating those pockets of poverty in the UK. So we look at this, we start to wonder, what perhaps is the true agenda behind Brexit. So the phrase I use here is I'm calling Brexit a crucible agenda. For those of you who don't know what a crucible is, it's a mould that you use to burn away steel, say, to create shapes and so on. So you burn away a lot of impurities and that sort of thing. So when you say something subject to a crucible, you're actually burning off the waste, the nastiness. So there's definitely a theme here, and this is a theme that Brexit politicians don't want to talk about too much, is that those who voted for Brexit voted against the system. And this was a system that is horribly resistant to change. UK democracy had badly needed reform for a long time. It got many fundamental problems with it. It's about as least democratic as you can get while still being a viable democracy. It's not a modern democracy. And it's a system that is very much geared towards protecting itself. The two main parties in British politics don't really want to change it. They like this little game of musical chairs that they get to play, where they hold the power all the time and no newcomer can really come in and challenge them. So you're not able to really get political reform on the agenda at all with the current system, unless, of course, you create a massive shock. And that is what several voters who voted for Brexit wanted. They wanted a seismic shock to the system. Now, they may not be able to articulate this very well. They may call it kicking the establishment. But fundamentally, this is what they wanted. Brexit was the means by which they could shake up the whole system and have the whole house of cards tumbling down. Now, I know what you might say, yes, in that case, that surely there must have been a better way to have created that change without creating economic destruction and political chaos that we are currently seeing. And yes, there would be many better ways. But perhaps many people take the view that it just wasn't going to happen. The system was too geared toward protecting itself. And whilst Brexit might perhaps be a little bit of a red herring in terms of some of the issues, it would deliver what they wanted. And that was to really force change in the UK democratic system. So what Brexit really has done is also stripped away the ability to blame the EU for all those problems. After all, the lack of funding, the lack of ability to make a coherent, intelligent decision to tackle crises. The EU doesn't necessarily excel at doing those things either, it has to be said. But it has definitely exposed that Westminster is no faster, is no better at tackling today's challenges than the EU are. But the politicians in charge at Westminster can no longer blame other people. They are the ones that can only be held directly accountable for all the messes that they have caused. So this leads to an interesting further argument. Surely, when Boris Johnson was elected, many people have thought that is the worst man you could pick for the job, for many reasons. But actually, there's perhaps a counter-argument here. Perhaps he is actually the best man for the job. Think of what he has done. He has exposed corruption. He has exposed how fragile the UK system, how vulnerable it is to unscrupulous individuals that will happily break the law and pervert the conventions for their own ends. Admittedly, Boris Johnson may have done all of that unwittingly through incompetence. I don't think he intended to do those things. He obviously just couldn't help himself. But if you voted for Brexit because you wanted the change and you wanted everybody to see just how rotten and terrible the Westminster system is, then it can't be argued that Boris Johnson done a very good job of doing that through the absolute chaos that his government has caused. It's burnt away, the mark of civility, perhaps as I called it in a previous video, burnt away that thin veneer that Westminster was a functioning, decent democracy, and exposed it for all the weaknesses and how rotten it actually is, and how bad it is at making decisions, at being held accountable for the impact of the decision made by senior leaders at Westminster. So with that sort of agenda in mind, then Brexit painfully perhaps, but doing what it was intended to do. So where do we go from here? Where do we go next in the middle of all this chaos? Well, I'd ask you to think about what democracy is. And there's two big things I would highlight to you. One is democracy is a form of battle, but through non-violent means. And everything I've explained in this video about the democratic deficit and globalisation, those Brexit politicians, whether in the Brexit Party, whether in the Conservative Party, they know those arguments. They know people voted for their reasons. So in this battle to retain power, what they're going to be doing is trying to blunt those arguments, trying to blunt the ability of the opposition to take power away from them. That is why there's a levelling up agenda. That is why there is this global Britain theme. They're not intended to actually succeed on the international circuit, or even nationally. They're there to blunt the political argument. Because if the opposition parties in England are able to build a narrative and consensus around this thing like democratic reform, like improved accountability, they could probably build enough consensus to challenge those who promoted Brexit, who implemented Brexit. And you can see some of that narrative happening in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. Those politicians there are strengthening the argument for pointing at just how bad and how rotten Westminster is, and of the need to have a better system. And perhaps that will translate into England as well, although at the moment the signs are not exactly very clear in that respect. So the final thought that I would leave here is that if you are in a conversation with somebody who still believes in Brexit, perhaps a little bit disillusioned with the current state of affairs, remember that there is scope for consensus. If they voted for immigration racist reasons, and that's the only reason why they voted, then there isn't much of a conversation to be had. But if you can delve a little bit more into what it is they truly voted for when they voted for Brexit, and you hit upon those themes of accountability and the democratic deficit and so on, then there's definitely scope for those who voted for and against Brexit to build a consensus. Because everybody can see now that the current system is not working. What is missing is a consensus, whether that's a political party or political leader, who will portray a vision, a picture for people to get behind, to move forward, whether that's implementing Brexit, reversing Brexit, but more fundamentally, fixing the complete and utter chaotic mess at Westminster. Because that, indisputably, is the priority. So remember that these people, misguided as perhaps you may think they have been, they did, in their heart, and according to their belief, they voted for democracy. And voting for democracy and improved democracy is not a bad thing to do, in all honesty. Albeit, we could perhaps wish that there were better routes by which that could have been achieved. So I hope you found this counter-argument a bit more interesting. And I welcome your comment and thought in the box below, and please do take if you liked or disliked this line of argument.